This episode of the Indian AvGeek is dedicated to all the victims and a survivor of the Air India 171 accident. May God give them peace. Hello, my fellow geeks. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Indian AvGeek. My name is Vishal Mehra. Our guest for this week is Brian Summers, founder and editor of the Airline Observer. Brian's been decoding the airline business longer than most of us have been collecting boarding passes. From leading aviation coverage at Skift to bylines in Condé Nast Traveler, Aviation Week, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times, his reporting has been the go-to in-flight entertainment for aviation insiders. He has appeared on CNN, CBS, BBC, and NPR. And if there's a major airline shakeup, chances are Brian's already written the definitive take on it. Possibly while sipping coffee at LAX Terminal 4. Why LAX? We'll get to know soon. With a journalism pedigree from Northwestern and USC and an MBA from UCLA Anderson, Brian brings both storytelling flair and business savvy to the skies. Welcome to the Indian AvGeek, Brian.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
How did you fall in love with aviation?
Well, I've been interested in aviation since I was a little kid. I had two interests or loves as a kid growing up in Chicago. One was Chicago Cubs, a Major League Baseball team. I was obsessed with them, and I'm still obsessed with them. And the other was to travel and mainly fly either United Airlines or American Airlines out of Chicago O'Hare. So I was trained as a journalist at university and also at graduate school. And the first thing that I did was I went to cover sports. I wanted to write about baseball for my entire life. And I just found when I was covering sports, I never covered baseball every day, but I covered it a little bit, that it wasn't as much fun as I thought it was going to be as a kid. And then I got a job here in Los Angeles, covering Los Angeles International Airport. And that was in I think I was 30 at the time. And I just fell in love with it. I loved being on the ramp. I loved being around airplanes. I loved the journalistic aspect of being able to ask executives how and why they were making decisions. As people know, it's a very complicated business. You have the operation side, you have the commercial side, and that was about 12 years ago now, and I have not looked back. Every year I've gotten more intense with my aviation coverage. I still love sports as a fan, almost the way I did as I was a kid, but I'm very glad that I do this for a living instead.
Very interesting. You just mentioned that you've been covering airlines for 12 years or so. How has your perspective on the industry evolved over the past decade?
Yeah, well, one of the great things about being a journalist is you can cover all kinds of different things and see what you like. So that first job that I talked about when I covered LAX, I also had a couple of other things that I was supposed to cover. One of them was California politics, which I didn't like very much. And another of them was the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. Those are two of our largest ports in the U.S. A lot of the goods that we get shipped here come through those ports. It is a very big deal. It's a big economic engine for the city of Los Angeles and the whole region here. It's just that I didn't like that stuff as much. And I found myself gravitating to the airport over and over again, probably for the same reason that you came up with this podcast idea. For people who really like airplanes, it is very intoxicating. One is just to be around the machines. They're very neat machines. But I also found that I had more of a business background. I'm a little less interested in the technology or the engines and the airframes and things like that, and more interested in how airlines make their money commercially, the frequent flyer programs, stuff like that. And in the US, of course, most airlines make a bulk of their money on these frequent flyer programs, but also setting ticket prices, everything along those lines. You asked how it has changed in the last 12 years. I've been talking to people in the industry about this, and I think it has changed a little bit just relating to geopolitics, right? We talk about, the good old days in a lot of regions, and generally speaking, the past wasn't any better than the current times for a lot of things. Uh, but when I first started covering this industry, we didn't have the same airspace challenges. We didn't have the same issues with countries kind of shutting off access to other countries. I think it was a simpler time when I started covering it. And as somebody who got my start covering LAX, it was a time when pretty much every airline in the world wanted to fly to LAX.
The past 10 days or so have been very tough for aviation, for our industry, due to well known and obvious reasons. You are the editor of the Airline Observer, and if I may ask, what else are you tracking in global aviation right now, Brian?
Was extremely unfortunate. We're going to have to hear from the authorities what had happened. Beyond that, I will tell you, I mostly cover aviation through a North America lens. I told you that I was trained as a journalist, and what I have found and what I learned over the years is that people respect authority. So they'll come to you if they want to learn about the Indian market. They don't really want to learn about the Indian market. For me, I don't live there. I was there a couple of weeks ago for a few days, but that's what we call parachute journalism, right? You parachute in, you see what you can grab, and then you leave. The North American airlines I'm covering day in and day out, and I don't know if you want to talk about that. So we're seeing in the U.S. market now some softness domestically, also in flights into Canada. And this is spooking US carriers because the US market is a great domestic market. It's where airlines have made a lot of money. Internationally, things are looking better for US carriers, but there's some concern that this may not last forever. And I'd say there's, the theme of the United States right now is economic uncertainty or just uncertainty generally. And that is something that I'm watching very, very carefully.
Yeah, protectionism probably won't help the industry, and but unfortunately, that's what we've been seeing. You had mentioned parachute journalism. Personally, I wouldn't put it like that. I think there are advantages of coming in cold as well. You recently attended the IATA AGM in New Delhi, the first in India in what, 42 years. What were your key takeaways from the event?
Well, first of all, I had a great time in New Delhi. It was my first time there. It's such a dynamic place and dynamic city, and it wasn't too hot, which I appreciated. The second thing I'll just mention is that things in aviation change so quickly. So I think I've covered maybe six of these IATA general meetings, and what generally gets airline executives nervous is not knowing what's going to happen in the future. So there are all these kind of half jokes about how because all these airlines fly all over the world, you have your airspace issues, you have to worry about wars, you have to worry about a coup, you have to worry about natural disasters, all these things. So I know that this is sort of nuts, but as you and I are taping, if you can think back to 2 weeks ago, it was a better situation then than
Yeah,
it is now.
in so many
Um,
ways. Yes.
and so the mood at the AGM was not bad because while it is not great that a lot of airlines in the world cannot fly over Russia airspace, and we have this India Pakistan airspace issue as well, all that stuff by the time of the AGM, which is in early June, had already happened. And so airlines understand, okay, this happened. We've already fixed it. Let's move on to the next crisis. But now we have a crisis with Israel and Iran. We have other new issues. Um, the AGM, I will say, was pretty positive given that time. But things change very quickly.
And you would have thought that from the IATA AGM to Paris Air Show, things would have gotten more upbeat.
Well, exactly. And of course we had the crash, which again we won't speculate on, but I think everybody in the industry, especially during this period where we don't know what happened, they freeze a little bit. So I'm obviously not in Paris right now, but I understand that Boeing isn't doing a lot of meeting with the media or meeting with customers. Nobody knows quite what's going on, and
No,
to go
Stephanie.
back to that word uncertainty, like nobody likes the uncertainty.
Yeah, Stephanie Pope was in India during that time. She, along with the senior management of GE Aerospace, met with the chairman of Air India and other senior executives. Well reported here in local press. They were in New Delhi. I guess we will know about those meetings in weeks to come.
Right. And again, I don't follow everywhere in the world quite as closely, but you talk about what happened in the AGM. I spent more than an hour with Tim Clark, the president of Emirates, and we talked about all these things that had gone wrong in global airspace and geopolitics. But we didn't talk about Iran closing its airspace, which is a really big deal. Maybe not for the US carriers, but it's a big deal for Emirates. And I don't know that maybe people saw it coming, but I don't know that they saw that it was going to come right when it did.
Let's ponder on that for a second more, Brian. What was your conversation with Tim Clark like? What did he tell you about Indigo?
I have a feeling you may know the answer to that question because I did write about it. Uh, Tim Clark was goaded into answering this question by the Indian media, but he believes that Indigo, because it's based in such a large, dynamic, growing country, has made the wrong decision and has ordered way too many narrow body aircraft and not enough wide body aircraft. He built Emirates flying the biggest possible airplanes that he could. 777s, A380s, and he talks about how, the United Arab Emirates is a really small country and India is a really large country. And I know Indigo made a big deal of basically doubling its order for A350s during the AGM, but it's still very few aircraft, very few wide bodies on order,
That's him
considering
saying. That's him
that
saying this.
that's him saying that
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Very
Okay.
few wide bodies on order, considering the size of the order. Actually, I'll say it too. I mean, these are like what? It's almost like 1,000 narrow bodies and 60 wide bodies. It doesn't mean that Indigo's making the wrong decision. It's just Tim Clark was poking at that a little bit.
Yeah. I had the network planning head for Indigo on the show a few weeks back. I'm sure he would have a different opinion than Clark's.
You have to remember, though, that Tim Clark is very skilled, and there was a lot of media from India in the room, and Tim Clark is mad about something else, right? I mean, I'm sure most of your
Yes.
listeners understand this. He
Mad
wants
about
access.
bilaterals. Yeah.
Exactly. He wants access to the Indian market. The number of passengers that he can transport has been frozen for many years. And anytime he can kind of be sarcastic against Indian Airlines or talk about protectionism or talk about a bad decision from an Indian airline, you can imagine why he might want to take it.
Did he say anything about Air India as well?
You're based in India, and you probably know more about this than I do, but I will tell you the consensus maybe from international media or international airlines, which is that as great as the Air India turnaround has been and as much work that has been done, there is still a lot to go. And I'm not talking about the crash, I'm not talking about safety, anything like that. I'm talking about commercially, and that we've kind of reached a point where international observers like me look at Indigo as the airline in India right now, the
Yep.
growing airline, the airline that Air France and KLM and Virgin Atlantic want to work with,
And Delta.
and Delta. And Air India is kind of like, oh, that's cute. I hope they figure it out. They have a great history. We wish them the best. But you don't see them as being the same kind of fierce competitor that Tim Clark is going to punch at. People sometimes don't want to punch down, they want to punch up. Everyone's talking about India globally. Everybody's talking about Indigo globally, I should say.
How did the global aviation community react in your perspective to India's growing role, and what opportunities do you see for international collaboration?
Yeah, I think everybody was excited to be there. Everybody knows how important the India market is. I'll go back to what I said earlier. A lot of global airlines, they want access to the Indian market. There are not that many markets growing in the way that India is. And if there was a theme besides uncertainty, it was kind of like Tim Clark said. Other airlines want access, they want partnerships, they want to be a part of this market.
According to you, Brian, What are the biggest hurdles for India's aviation progress?
I can tell you just a little bit what I learned. It's not going to come
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
surprise to you. It's things, they talk about airport infrastructure and things like that. Tim Clark went on this big tangent, but it makes some sense about the number of people, the number of human beings that all of us who visited had to interact with at Delhi's airport, and the number of stamping of boarding passes, and just there's I think more friction in the airport experience than most people from other countries are used to. So that's a big thing, and then also access. Um, you know, Airlines they want access, and then as we mentioned, I cover the U.S. market. This is not necessarily an Indian issue, but the U.S. airlines, because of their own airspace restrictions, have a really hard time flying to India right now, and I know they'd like to fix that, but that's not really a bilateral issue between the U.S. and India.
One would have thought that would have been solved by now, but uh, I guess the friendship between Trump and Putin isn't working as per the plan. Anyways, sometimes I wonder if things would be slightly better if Tim Clark was a bit more like Ben Smith and Ben Smith a bit more like Tim Clark.
And why is that?
Well, I somehow feel that Ben Smith could be a bit more expressive sometimes, and Tim Clark could definitely do with less of a bull in China shop attitude and maybe a bit more toned down.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to know too much about Ben Smith, but Ben Smith, listeners probably know, is the CEO of Air France KLM. And I know him better than I know most European airline executives because he was president for a while and COO of Air Canada. Um, I think Tim Clark and Ben Smith are just completely different people because Ben Smith is, in my mind, probably the most enthusiastic airline executive in the world. It's just that his enthusiasm is kind of internal for people who work in the industry. So if you meet him at a cocktail party or you go to his office and it's one on one, he will talk for hours about how much he loves aviation, and nobody gets more excited or riled up by aviation. But it's just that, I cover these people and they have a right to be the people that they want to be. Sometimes when the microphone gets turned on and the room is filled, they act a little bit differently, and that's their prerogative. So Ben Smith, very, very enthusiastic in real life, maybe a little bit different with media.
Got it. How do you see the balance between profitability and sustainability shaping strategies of airlines in the coming year?
All right. Do you want the real answer?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, I can't speak for every airline in the world because I am US based. So maybe I should not try. But here in the United States is 100% about profitability. And airlines are only talking about sustainability because they know that they're supposed to. But the point of the matter is to make money. And while I cannot talk about individual global markets, I have talked to enough people to know that IATA sets these guidelines. They have one for 2050, right? Zero net new emissions from when? From 20 whatever. Yeah, so the idea is that there'll be no new net emissions for 35 years or whatever. Uh, you know, Airline executives, like, they give it their best shot, but everybody knows they're not going to make these targets. Everybody knows, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people know that sustainable aviation fuel is not going to save the industry. There isn't enough of it, or what there is too expensive. Sustainability is just something that people know that they need to talk about. But it's flying around the world on a moment's notice. It's never going to be that sustainable.
Yeah, it's probably essential material for annual reports, probably in the
Right.
for.
Right. And the one saving grace is that fuel is very, very expensive. So airlines do want to fly more efficiently. They want to burn less fuel. They want new engines and new aircraft capable of burning less fuel. But the reason for it is because they want to save money. And so maybe that's a win-win.
That is exactly why I'm very excited personally about JetZero But we'll get to that later. Staying on profitability, airlines are facing tight margins despite rising profits. The industry is projected to earn what, a net profit of $36 billion on revenues of almost $1,000 billion. Now, when broken down, that translates to just about $7.2 in net profit per passenger, with a net margin of barely 3.7%. Now, apart from all the geopolitics that we see, what do you think are the biggest risks to the current outlook for the industry?
Well, this is not a risk for the India market because you essentially have two large airlines. But in other markets, you hear airline executives just complain that there are too many airlines chasing too few passengers. So this is an issue in Europe, especially at the low cost for the low cost airlines. It's also an issue for these airlines like, why does Lat Polish need to exist? Why does TAP Air Portugal need to exist? Luckily, SAS, the Scandinavian airline, is now partially owned by Air France KLM, so that helps. But there's this idea that there needs to be more consolidation in certain markets. We also see that in the United States, especially with our ultra low cost carriers. We just have too many airlines trying to sell $19 fares to the most cost conscious people. There needs to be fewer airlines in a lot of these markets.
How are airlines adapting to the challenges of aircraft delivery delays, supply chain challenges, and grounded fleets?
They're complaining a lot.
That helps.
And they're also grounding airplanes. In some cases, they're keeping airplanes longer than they had expected. So maybe a 20-year-old airplane was slated for retirement, but they keep it going. Of course, that airline burns more fuel, so that's not great for the environment. It's not great for operating costs, but the airlines do it because they have to. Now, you probably know, and again, this may not be the case in the India market because we all need all the airplanes that you can fly. There's a lot of passengers out there. But in the more saturated markets of Europe and North America, there is kind of this joke that the supply chain issues have saved the industry because all these airlines, when times are good, they go out there and they order new airplanes and they have these huge growth plans. And when every airline wants to grow at the same time, you end up with overcapacity. And now, in a period where demand is not as good as airlines had thought, like the running joke is like, could you imagine if Boeing and Airbus had actually delivered all the airplanes that they were supposed to? Like, if you think things are bad now, they would have been worse otherwise. So for airlines that really need to grow, that are in growing markets, the supply chain issues are bad. But in the rest of the world, I think there's an understanding that it keeps growth in check, and maybe it's not the worst thing in the world.
Do you think there are any lessons global airlines can learn from the rapid growth and operational success of IndiGo? I know there's a big delta between fleet size of an IndiGo and a big three American airline. Pardon the pun.
Can I flip the question on you a little bit?
Yeah.
I think that, well, first of all, Indigo Airlines has been an incredibly run airline for so long. It's the envy of the world. They've made so much money. It's been wonderful to see. But I also think that now that Indigo is in the next stage of its growth, Indigo needs to look at what other airlines have done to see what it can do because it made all of its money, right, with like short haul flying, single class flying, lowest cost in the industry. Now they're trying to be all things to all people. And throughout history, some airlines have gotten themselves in trouble when they add a business class and they've never sold a business class before. Or, we talked about how Tim Clark said Indigo should have added more wide bodies, but you also see airlines that have been narrow body operators for their entire history. They go out and get a new fleet type and it doesn't go quite as well as they had hoped. Now, Peter Elbers, the CEO at Indigo, has been through this before. I think he knows what he's doing. I assume he was hired for this reason. But the Indigo of the future is not going to be the same as the one that made all that money. And so they should be looking toward other airlines that have gone through this just to make sure that they can do everything that they say that they're going to do.
There are two things I want to touch upon based on what you just said, Brian. Point one, you are absolutely right. Indigo of tomorrow is certainly not the Indigo of yesterday. Indigo and Delta are amongst the two most valuable airlines in the world by market cap. It's a remarkable feat for a low cost carrier from India, especially considering that a year ago, Indigo was probably ranked fourth globally. Now, the airlines focus on efficiency, on cost competitiveness, and a growing international footprint certainly seems to be paying off. Indian market itself, the profitability isn't that much on domestic routes. Airlines make money on international routes. European routes for Indian airlines are coveted, especially London. You can never have enough flights between Indian airports and London, for example. I think that's what Indigo is also trying to do now. They've made money domestically and regional short haul flying, but medium to long haul is where they truly feel the big bucks lie for them.
Oh,
So,
I didn't say it wasn't going to work. In fact, I am hopeful that it works, and I think it should work. But I also think, and I know Peter Elbers is doing this, you got to look at other airlines that have gone through this and make sure that you're following all the best practices because you are changing the model.
and funnily enough, my second point on this, one of the gentlemen, very instrumental in Indigo's success story, Rakesh Gangwal.
Is now the chairman of Southwest Airlines.
Yes.
Yes.
So there is brain drain both ways then. And hopefully, Southwest gets benefited from Rakesh Gangwal's experience.
So let me ask you this. Do you think Southwest is going to make any changes based on Rakesh's experience?
Well, aren't you already seeing some code shares?
Yes.
They,
Yeah.
yeah.
Iceland Air.
There are his footprints all over as Southwest becomes less Southwesty, if there's a word like that. You see upselling, you see no free bags, and he's a stickler for details and costs. Profitability will be his mantra. So
That's why they're in business, right?
that's why they're in business. Absolutely. India becoming a global hub is far into the future, but to be a regional hub, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities for Indian aviation, according to you, Brian, besides the market access bit we already spoke about?
We talked about parachuting in and out. I don't feel knowledgeable enough about Indian airports. You can run into some trouble as a journalist being like, well, I spent 45 minutes in New Delhi airport, so this is what needs to change.
Yeah.
But I'm sure these airports will get where they need to be. IATA makes a big deal out of this, but I think it's true. In a lot of countries, it depends on how much investment the government is willing to make in these airports because they're basically part of the national infrastructure. Most of the time, airlines are not paying for airports. And it seems like the government of India is heavily invested in aviation now. And I think that can only lead to good things.
Yeah. I was surprised that even the Prime Minister attended the meet, so clearly important to him and the government. Brian, I wish you had seen the Bangalore or the Mumbai airport. Much more impressive aesthetically, in my opinion. In fact, in my humble opinion, Bangalore is probably the top 3 or top 2 most visually appealing airports in the world. The new terminal is just fantastic. Delhi is just a big terminal, nothing else. Maybe next time.
I would like that very much.
What emerging technologies or business models, in your opinion, you think will have the biggest impact on the airline industry?
I was talking to somebody recently at an airport, and they wanted to know about all the emerging technologies that they could use. And maybe I was a little dour in my response, but I just said, people want the airport to work. They want the airline to work. They want everything to be without friction. Like they want at the airport, they want the bathrooms to be clean. There's this kind of joke sometimes about like just make the trains run on time. Like the only technology that I really want to see an airline use is the one that makes the airplanes run on time, the one that I can get to the airport as late as possible, the one where I know that security is going to be as quick as possible, or if it's not, I know what to expect all the time. Like, why do people get so frantic and upset and nervous at the airport? It's because they don't know what to expect. They don't know if it's going to be a long wait. They don't know what's going to happen with their layover. They don't know if their flight's going to be on time. So any technology that I like to see is one that can take all the guessing out of the airline experience, and just so I know what to expect.
What are your thoughts on Boom? Will supersonic travel make a comeback?
I told you I'm not a hardware man necessarily. I can tell you that there is a lot of skepticism about Boom, and it seems like the president of the United States is very bullish on Boom. He might be the only one. I just don't hear that it's ready for prime time. There aren't a whole lot of routes in the United States that it would work for. It would work for London to New York. The airplane, as we understand it, doesn't have trans-Pacific range. So, to fly from London to Tokyo requires a stop in Anchorage, the way they're selling the airplane. I suppose it's cool that supersonic flight could come back, but I just don't know that many people who are taking that aircraft seriously.
So I had Brian Kelly on the last episode, and he was quite excited by the prospects of it all.
There's a lot to be excited about.
There is.
It's just that as a reporter who speaks to network planners, I can tell you they're not.
And your thoughts on JetZero? The Air Show, a podcast that you're also a part of, recently did a detailed episode on it. I'm sure you're well aware, Brian.
We did. So I have a podcast called The Air Show. Thank you for mentioning it. But my colleagues on The Air Show, my two co-hosts, John Ostrower and Brett Snyder, went to JetZero for a media day recently. And then the two of them did an episode on it while I was in India at the IATA AGM. So I was not at the media day, and I was not on that broadcast either.
I heard the show personally, and I cannot recommend it enough to people who are keen to learn more about the company, the blended wing model, and the passenger experience of it all.
So John Ostrower is one of my co-hosts, and he knows more about airframes and engines than anybody in this industry, and he says it's legitimate. So I take his word for it. It's gonna be interesting to watch that technology. You're right, people are taking it much more seriously than Boom.
All right, Brian, thank you so very much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. I really appreciate it.
This was my great pleasure. Maybe next time we could do it in person. Thank you so much for having me.
I had troubles over the last week or so in figuring out the right balance and the right guest for this episode, and I'm very pleased with how it turned out. It was a great experience chatting with Brian and knowing his perspectives on different aspects of the business. Next week, it will be the turn of the Indian AvGeek, and I cannot wait to share that fantastic episode with all of you, with a gem of a human being and a great marketeer. As usual, don't forget to subscribe and share this episode of the Indian AvGeek with your fellow AvGeeks. Brian is at Brian Summers on X, although he will prefer you to visit the airlineobserver.com for more on him. I am at Vishal Mehra on X. With that, keep your tray tables up, your seatbelts fastened. I wish you well and happy flying, my friends.